Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, episode 494, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, Part 6. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, I have Winky, our new Jack Russell Terrier mix with me. And Winky's at my side. He might be a little bit out of camera range, but he might be affecting my position and movements because he's right here with me, right next to me. Today's show will continue with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Here, the author looks at the struggles of minorities, low-wage workers, women, veterans, and others. Today's show will feature background footage from Lane Pinnacle Trail. Well, it's really Mountains to Sea Trail. It just goes to Lane Pinnacle. Anyway, to get there, take the Blue Ridge Parkway, heading north from Asheville, North Carolina. When you see the sign saying entering Craggy Gardens, just a short distance past that, maybe 150 feet or so, there's a pull-off to the left, or maybe it's more like a couple hundred feet or more. But anyway, a short distance later, there's a pull-off on the left. You just pull there and park. It's a little dirt area. Then you go along the parkway, heading back towards Asheville. You walk along the parkway, maybe 100 feet, couple hundred feet, and then the Mountains to Sea Trail will go off to the right into the woods. Eventually, you come to Lane Pinnacle. When you get to Lane Pinnacle, the trail will take a sharp right turn right next to the view. That's how you know you're there. From the view, you could see the North Fork Reservoir. North Fork Reservoir supplies Asheville, North Carolina, and surrounding areas with drinking water. So, now, let's continue with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. It was unrealistic to expect that the Germans should treat the United States as neutral in the war when the U.S. had been shipping great amounts of war materials to Germany's enemies. In early 1915, the British liner Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine. She sank in 18 minutes, and 1,198 people died, including 124 Americans. The United States claimed the Lusitania carried an innocent cargo, and therefore the torpedoing was a monstrous German atrocity. Actually, the Lusitania was heavily armed. It carried 1,248 cases of 3-inch shells, 4,927 boxes of cartridges, 1,000 rounds in each box, and 2,000 more cases of small arms ammunition. Her manifests were falsified to hide this fact, and the British and American governments lied about the cargo. Now, let's go to page 363. A remarkably perceptive article on the nature of the First World War appeared in May 1915 in the Atlantic Monthly. written by W.E.B. Du Bois. It was titled The African Roots of War. It was a war for empire, of which the struggle between Germany and the Allies over Africa was both symbol and reality. In a very real sense, Africa is a prime cause of this terrible overturning of civilization which we have lived to see. Africa, Du Bois said, is the land of the 20th century because of the gold and diamonds of South Africa, the cocoa of Angola and Nigeria, the rubber and ivory of the Congo, the palm oil of the West Coast. Labor War Veterans Guard was organized to keep the peace. On the blackboard at one of its headquarters was written, "The purpose of this organization is to preserve law and order without the use of force. No volunteer will have any police power or be allowed to carry weapons of any sort, but to use persuasion only. During the strike, crime in the city decreased. The commander of the U.S. Army detachment sent into the area told the strikers' committee that in 40 years of military experience he hadn't seen so quiet and orderly a city." A poem printed in the Seattle Union Record, a daily newspaper put out by labor people by someone named Anise. What scares them most is that nothing happens. They are ready for disturbances. They have machine guns and soldiers, but this smiling silence is uncanny. The businessmen don't understand that sort of weapon. It is your smile that is upsetting. Their reliance on artillery, brother. It is the garbage wagons that go along this street marked exempt by strike committee. It is the milk stations that are getting better daily, and the 300 war veterans of labor handling the crowds without guns. For these things speak of a new power and a new world that they do not feel at home in. Now, let's go to page 382. The Ku Klux Klan was revived in the 1920s and it spread into the North. By 1924, had 4.5 million members. The NAACP seemed helpless in the face of mob violence and race hatred everywhere. The impossibility of the black persons ever being considered equal in white America was the theme of the nationalist movement led in the 1920s by Marcus Garvey. He preached black pride, racial separation, and a return to Africa, which to him held the only hope for black unity and survival. But Garvey's movement, inspiring as it was to some blacks, could not make much headway against the powerful white supremacy currents of the post-war decade. There was some truth to the standard picture of the 20s as a time of prosperity and fun, the jazz age, the roaring 20s. Unemployment was down from 4,270,000 in 1921 to a little over 2 million in 1927. The general level of wages for workers rose.
Some farmers made a lot of money. The 40% of all families who made over $2,000 a year could buy new gadgets, autos, radios, refrigerators. Millions of people were not doing badly, and they could shut out of the picture the others, the tenant farmers, black and white, the immigrant families in the big cities, either without work or not making enough to get the basic necessities. Now let's go to page 387. After the crash, the economy was stunned, barely moving. Over 5,000 banks closed and huge numbers of businesses, unable to get money, closed too. Those that continued laid off employees and cut the wages of those who remained again and again. Industrial production fell by 50%, and by 1933, perhaps 15 million, no one knew exactly, 1/4 or 1/3 of the labor force were out of work. The Ford Motor Company, which in the spring of 1929 had employed 128,000 workers, was down to 37,000 by August of 1931. By the end of 1930, almost half of the 280,000 textile mill workers in New England were out of work. Former President Calvin Coolidge commented with his customary wisdom, when more and more people are thrown out of work, unemployment results. He spoke again in early 1931. The country is not in good condition. Clearly, those responsible for organizing the economy did not know what happened and were baffled by it, refused to recognize it, and found reasons other than the failure of the system. Herbert Hoover had said not long before the crash, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." Henry Ford, in March 1931, said the crisis was here because the average man won't really do a day's work unless he is caught and cannot get out of it. There is plenty of work to do if people would do it. A few weeks later, he laid off 75,000 workers. There were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it, to sell it. Warehouses were full of clothing, but people could not afford it. There were lots of houses, but they stayed empty because people couldn't pay the rent, had been evicted, and now lived in shacks and quickly formed Hoovervilles built on garbage dumps. Now, let's go to page 391 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The anger of the veteran of the First World War, now without work, his family hungry, led to the march of the Bonus Army to Washington in the spring and summer of 1932. War veterans holding government bonus certificates, which were due years in the future, demanded that Congress pay off on them now, when the money was desperately needed. And so they began to move to Washington from all over the country, with wives and children, or alone. They came in broken down old autos, stealing rides on freight trains, or hitchhiking. They were miners from West Virginia, sheet metal workers from Columbus, Georgia, and unemployed Polish veterans from Chicago. One family, husband, wife, 3-year-old boy, spent 3 months on freight trains coming from California. Chief Running Wolf, a jobless Mescalero Indian from New Mexico, showed up in full Indian dress with bow and arrow. More than 20,000 came. Most camped across the Potomac River from the capital on Anacostia Flats, where, as John Dos Passos wrote, the men are sleeping in little lean-tos built out of newspapers, cardboard boxes, packing crates, bits of tin, or tar paper roofing, every kind of cockeyed makeshift shelter from the rain scraped together out of the city dump. The bill to pay off the bonus passed the House, but was defeated in the Senate, and some veterans, discouraged, left. Most stayed, some encamped in government buildings near the Capitol, the rest on Anacostia Flats, and President Hoover ordered the army to evict them. 4 troops of cavalry, 4 companies of infantry, a machine gun squadron, and 6 tanks assembled near the White House. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the operation. Major Dwight Eisenhower, his aide. George S. Patton was one of the officers. MacArthur led his troops down Pennsylvania Avenue, used tear gas to clear veterans out of the old buildings, and set the buildings on fire. Then the army moved across the bridge to Anacostia. Thousands of veterans, wives, children began to run as the tear gas spread. The soldiers set fire to some of the huts, and soon the whole encampment was ablaze. When it was all over, 2 veterans had been shot to death. An 11-week-old baby had died. An 8-year-old boy was partially blinded by gas. 2 police had fractured skulls, and 1,000 veterans were injured by gas. Now let's go to page 399 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. In 1934 and 1935, hundreds of thousands of workers left out of the tightly controlled, exclusive unions of the American Federation of Labor began organizing in the new mass production industries: auto, rubber, packing house. The AFL could not ignore them. It set up a committee for industrial organization to organize these workers outside of craft lines. By industry, all workers in a plant belonging to one union. This committee, headed by John Lewis, then broke away and became the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Now, let's go to page 404. Black Harlem, with all the New Deal reforms, remained as it was. There, 350,000 people lived, 233 persons per acre, compared with 133 for the rest of Manhattan. In 25 years, its population had multiplied 6 times. 10,000 families lived in rat-infested cellars and basements. tuberculosis was common. Perhaps half of the married women worked as domestics. They traveled to the Bronx and gathered on street corners, slave markets, they were called, to be hired. Prostitution crept in. Two young black women, Ella Baker and Marvel Cook, wrote about this in The Crisis in 1935. Not only is human labor bartered and sold for the slave wage, but human love is also a marketable commodity, whether it is labor or love. The women arrive as early as 8 a.m. and remain as late as 1 p.m. or until they are hired. In rain or shine, hot or cold, they wait to work for 10, 15, and 20 cents per hour. In Harlem Hospital in 1932, proportionally twice as many people died as in Bellevue Hospital, which was in the white area downtown. Harlem was a place that bred crime, the bitter blossom of poverty, as Roy Otley and William Weatherby say in their essay, The Negro in New York. Now, let's go to page 421. Continuing on to page 422 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The bombing of Japanese cities continued the strategy of saturation bombing to destroy civilian morale. One nighttime firebombing of Tokyo took 80,000 lives. And then, on August 6, 1945, came the lone American plane in the sky over Hiroshima, dropping the first atomic bomb, leaving perhaps 100,000 Japanese dead, and tens of thousands more slowly dying from radiation poisoning. 12 U.S. Navy flyers in the Hiroshima City jail were killed in the bombing. In fact, a fact that the U.S. government has never officially acknowledged, according to historian Martin Sherwin. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, and perhaps 50,000 killed. Now, let's go to page 423, continuing on to page 424. If only the Americans have not insisted on unconditional surrender, that is, if they were willing to accept one condition to the surrender, that the emperor, a holy figure to the Japanese, remain in place, the Japanese would have agreed to stop the war. Why did the United States not take that small step to save both American and Japanese lives? Was it because too much money and effort had been invested in the atomic bomb not to drop it? General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, described Truman as a man on a toboggan, the momentum too great to stop it. Or was it? As British scientist P.M.S. Blackett suggested, that the United States was anxious to drop the bomb before the Russians entered the war against Japan? The Russians had secretly agreed they were officially not at war with Japan. They would come into the war 90 days after the end of the European War. That turned out to be May 8th. And so on August 8th, the Russians were due to declare war on Japan. But by then, the big bomb had been dropped, and the next day a second one would be dropped on Nagasaki. The Japanese would surrender to the United States, not the Russians. And the United States would be the occupier of post-war Japan. In other words, Blackett says, the dropping of the bomb was the first major operation of the Cold Diplomatic War with Russia. Blackett is supported by American historian Gar Alperovitz, who notes a diary entry for July 28, 1945, by the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, describing Secretary of State James F. Burns as the most anxious to get the Japanese affair over with before the Russians got in. Truman had said, "The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in this first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians." It was a preposterous statement. Those 100,000 killed in Hiroshima were almost all civilians. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey said in its official report, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen as targets because of their concentration of activities and population. The dropping of the second bomb on Nagasaki seems to have been scheduled in advance, and no one has ever been able to explain why it was dropped. Was it because this was a plutonium bomb, whereas the Hiroshima bomb was a uranium bomb? Were the dead and irradiated of Nagasaki victims of a scientific experiment? Martin Sherwin says that among the Nagasaki dead were probably American prisoners of war. He notes a message of July 31st from headquarters, U.S. Army Strategic Air Forces, Guam, to the War Department. Reports of prisoner of war sources, not verified by photos, give location of Allied.
Casey Waters Show. Producer, Casey Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, caseywaters2@caseywaters.com.